Be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue with redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. We were talking about stalking, Ms. LaViolette.
Yes.
All right. And were you asked questions about stalking behavior on behalf of Ms. Arias, alleged behavior on behalf of Ms. Arias?
Yes.
So let's talk about some of those things, too. You were specifically asked about that there's this breakup at the end of June, and then she moves to Mesa. She was in California at the time, and then she moves to Mesa after that, right?
Yes.
And whether or not you considered that any type of stalking behavior, right?
Yes.
When she moved, from the time of the breakup to the time she moved, and then after that, was there continued contact between the both of them?
Yes, there was.
And it wasn't just one-sided contact, was it?
No, both people were contacting each other.
And once she moved there, moved to Mesa, Mr. Alexander continued to contact her, right?
Yes, he did.
Judge, may I approach? You may. I'm showing you Exhibit 395 and 395.001. They're almost the same. One has a date on it. Do you see those?
Yes. Yes.
I'll keep going with the date on the back. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to take the other one. All right, and from your understanding, is this an email from Mr. Alexander to Ms. Arias?
Yes.
And the email, there's a picture, and this is Exhibit 395.001 in evidence. There's a picture of a maid, right, in a sexy maid outfit.
Correct.
And based on the timing of this email, do we know that it was sent from Mr. Alexander on August 2nd, 2007?
Yes.
And so he sent her an email with a picture of a maid outfit, right?
Yes.
Just shortly after she moved.
Correct.
And is it your understanding that Ms. Arias would clean Mr. Alexander's home?
Yes.
And when she did he want her to wear a maid outfit like this? Is that the idea?
It's indicated.
Okay. And this is something that he requested of her shortly after she moved to Mesa.
Yes.
Does that indicate any fear on his behalf at all of her?
No, not that I can see.
Overruled.
Not that I can see.
Generally speaking, would you expect somebody who is someone who's afraid of a stalker to allow them come over to their house and clean it?
No, you would not expect that to happen.
Would you expect them to allow them to come to their house when you're not home, to not only to clean it and be there while you're not there?
No, you would not expect that.
And so she moves to Mesa, and then there were some, the contact between the two parties continued from August on, right?
Correct.
And in fact, in September, the next month, did he take her on a trip to Havasupai?
Yes, he did.
And on that particular trip, were they together with Mr. Freeman and Ms. Freeman?
Yes, they were.
When they took a trip to New Mexico the next month, were they alone?
They were alone the next month.
Is that typical of somebody to take vacations with their stalker?
No, you don't see people taking vacations with their stalker.
Or I guess a stalker, or just somebody who they're afraid of, like that?
No, you try to get away from your stalker.
And do you see any evidence of that in the context of their relationship?
No, I don't.
There was some conversation about, or questions about, when Miss Arias came to Mr. Alexander's house and saw that he was with another woman in August of 2007, right?
Yes, there was.
And I think the implication was that that's some type of stalking behavior, right?
Correct.
However, you were asked the question that the fact that she came over and saw him with another woman, is this an indication that their relationship is over because isn't this an indication that the relationship is over because he's with another woman? Do you remember that question?
Yes,
But if we were to consider the fact that Mr. Alexander's with another woman to be an indication that a relationship is over, then wouldn't we have to consider that Miss Andrews' relationship was over as well?
yes,
Because wasn't he also in August of 2007 in a relationship with Miss Andrews?
yes,
And was he in a relationship with Miss Andrews at the same time that he's still in a relationship with Jodi?
yes, he was.
And I guess then still at the same time that he's caught on the couch making out with some unknown woman.
Correct.
So would that be an unfair characterization to say that because he's caught making out with another woman, that Jodi is supposed to understand that their relationship is over, given on his past behavior?
Objection, relevance, foundation, unfair.
Sustained.
To your knowledge, did Miss Arias catch him cheating when they were officially dating?
Yes, she did.
And is that something that throughout their relationship did you see a pattern of?
Yes.
What was the pattern that you saw?
The pattern was in general through written information between women, but there were a couple of women at least that he had face-to-face contact with, as of evidenced in their instant messages or their G chats. I don't know what those things are, but
Okay.
they were in the written materials.
And he's having these conversations with these women?
He's had sexual conversations, flirtatious conversations, and at least with three of them has had face-to-face time with them.
And during these conversations, part of the time during these conversations, is he also still dating Miss Andrews?
Yes.
And after Miss Andrews, was he pursuing a woman named Mimi Hall?
Yes, he was.
And while he's pursuing Mimi Hall, is he also having these sexual conversations with these other women?
Yes, he is.
And besides having these sexual conversations with these other women, is he also having a relationship with Jodi?
Yes, he is.
On May 2nd, so now this is 17 days prior to him complaining that he's supposedly afraid of Jodi. And this is exhibit number 392. You see from Travis Alexander at the top?
Yes.
And you see that he sends a text message, send me some of the pictures I want to see of you right now.
Yes.
Is that something that somebody would ask for pictures from somebody they were afraid of?
Well, if you're talking about in the stalking range, I would say no.
Okay. And are you aware of throughout the relationship between Miss Arias and Mr. Alexander, did Mr. Alexander ask Miss Arias for, I don't know if you want to say naughty or nude photos, did he ask for those types of photos from her more than once?
Yes.
And so 17 days before he complains about being afraid of her, he's asking for that as well.
Objection, foundation, the modifier, please. Extremely afraid.
Judge, may we approach?
Ladies and gentlemen, were any of you in the jury able to hear the bench conference we were just having? Did any of you hear anything that was said? All right, I see no hands. You may proceed.
I want to talk to you about questions with regard to the text messages from April 7th, 2008. Do you remember being asked questions about that?
Yes.
All right, you were asked questions about this particular text message, and this is when we're talking on April 7th, 2008. It begins, this is exhibit number 444. It begins with Mr. Alexander asking Miss Arias, where are you? Do you see that?
Beyond the scope, she was never asked about prosecution.
She was asked about April 7th text message.
Approach, please. You may continue.
Okay, so April 7th, 2008. All right, so we're talking about the text message, right?
Correct.
Okay, and you remember being asked questions about this long tirade on the second part of this text message, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you were asked questions about the importance of whether it's Michelle or Maria. Do you remember that? Or Marie, right?
Correct.
Can you tell us what importance this text message has for you? And if you need to review the text message up by yourself, I can bring it to you. Just let me know.
That would be good if I could look at it.
Okay. Can you tell us why this text message was relevant to your consideration with regard to their relationship?
Yes, do you want it back?
You can keep it, well, yeah, I'll take it back. Thanks. Okay, so can you tell us why this is relevant to your consideration?
For several reasons. One reason is that there was, at the time that they were talking about this story, which was about Maria and Michelle, that he was furious, he was angry, he was over the top with his anger, but he was angry about something that was actually happening. He was confronting or yelling at Jodi for giving him a BS story when in fact the story was true. At that time he was having a relationship with Lisa Andrews, and so it wasn't a BS story. It was a story that was true, and he got very angry and sort of went over the top. In addition to that, he threatens her. He tells her that he's going to tell people about her craziness and all that sort of thing.
You talked a little bit about that this morning. The prosecutor was asking you questions about he was saying stalking, and I think your answer was that seems more like blackmailing behavior.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
And blackmailing behavior when somebody threatens to send nasty, untrue information about another person out to the public?
Yes.
And is that something then, are you seeing that type of behavior here? When he threatens to tell all her close friends and her family about crazy things she's done?
Yes.
And then the threats, and does he go on then with the threats at the very end about after tomorrow it's going to get bad for you? Do you see that at the last?
Yes. Yes, and that feel the wrath.
All right. And is that something, why is that important to you?
Well, it doesn't just happen this time. There's more of a pattern of him throwing out, and they're not specific threats like I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to do that to you. They're more general threats like feel the wrath or my worst is worse, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And he does that in more than one situation. He repeats that.
And so is it not just this one particular conversation that you're relying upon in formulating your assessment that this was a domestically violent relationship?
No, it was based on lots of information.
Okay. And you can see that in this text message that we see the prosecutor talk to you about how he's blaming her for lying, right?
Yes.
And when in fact, this whole conversation is about the fact that he was cheating on Lisa Andrews, right?
Correct.
But that was true, wasn't it?
It was true.
And so we see him lying, blaming Jodi for lying, but in fact, wasn't it Mr. Alexander who was lying about his own relationship?
Yes, he was.
And in fact, when he's blaming Jodi for lying, he's blaming her for lying about something that was actually true.
Yes, he is.
Okay. You were asked questions about another text message on May 10th of 2008. It's going to take me a second to get that. Okay, we'll have to do without it for right now. Let's still talk about May 10th of 2008, okay?
Okay?
And you remember the prosecutor asking you questions about that?
Yes?
And this is the text message where Miss Arias mistakenly sends a text to Mr. Alexander, but it was meant for someone else. Do you remember that?
Correct.
Okay. And then the result from that, Mr. Alexander goes into a long tirade of why he's upset with her for doing such a thing. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to take a look at the text messages from January 4th. Here's May 10th. This is Exhibit 448. Okay, so we're talking about the first text message that starts with, that is mistakenly sent to Mr. Alexander, right?
Correct.
And there were some questions about that, about the fact that by the end of this tirade, Miss Arias sends Mr. Alexander what the text message again, the first part, and then finishing up what the text message would have been if she sent him the whole one. Do you know what I mean?
Kind of.
Okay. Well, in other words, the message that was sent to Mr. Alexander by mistake, it was broken up into two parts. Do you remember that?
Right.
Okay. And the first part got sent to Mr. Alexander, but the second part was deleted before it was sent to Mr. Alexander.
Correct.
Okay. And the entire text message conversation, this tirade, is about Mr. Alexander sending ordering Miss Arias to send him what that second part of the text message was.
Correct.
Okay. So at the end of this conversation, does she do that?
Yes.
And she sends it to him, and it really is of inconsequence, right? That unfortunately, he happens to be an ex-boyfriend.
Yes.
And this is something that Mr. Alexander wanted her to send to him to check to see what this text message was about, right?
Correct.
Is that any type of jealous behavior?
Well, on the part of Mr. Alexander, I would say, if he needs to have information about who she's seeing as a single woman, and they're talking about, at this point, pulling apart from each other, then him wanting to track down what she writes, because this is not the only time he does it.
Not the only time he does what?
It's not the only time he gets upset about the boyfriend. It's not the only time that he's told he's jealous. He's told he's jealous by the Hughes, that they laugh at that part where he says he's not. He's demonstrated jealous behavior with a man by the name of Abe. He's upset that she's seeing somebody. So, yeah, there seems to be a pattern in regard to Miss Arias that there's jealousy.
From Mr. Alexander.
Yes.
And when you say that you see this pattern, are you relying on just this one text message conversation?
No, not at all.
And all the things that you just talked to me about?
Yes.
And some of this, the fact that Miss Arias felt compelled somehow to actually send him the second part of the text message, does that speak to the type of position she was in at this point in their relationship?
Well, she's still connected enough that she wants to please him. She wants to comply with what he wants, and so she does.
Okay. And throughout this text message conversation, is Miss Arias apologizing?
Yes, she is.
So what about this text message conversation then is important to you with regard to your assessment? taken in context, obviously, with everything else that you've seen.
Well, taken in context, what you see is someone, and I'm speaking about Mr. Alexander here, who gets upset because she's dating someone else, who demands to see a text that she inadvertently sent in part to him and wants to see the rest of it, that he gets very angry, and when he gets very angry, he goes over the top, that she has a pattern of apologizing to him, and that eventually, throughout these text messages over time, there seems to be this cycle where they have this incident, they have an argument, Miss Arias apologizes, Mr. Alexander then apologizes, and they make up.
So you talked a little bit about the fact that he gets angry, and there were some questions this morning about anger. And you had talked about that people have a right to be angry, right?
Yes.
Is it important to you how people handle their anger?
Yes, it is.
And when somebody goes into a long tirade, what does that mean for you with regard to their anger?
Well, first of all, that they have a way of keeping that anger going. So they have a way of somehow pulling in whatever that is that makes them feel righteous to keep going with their anger. And secondly, it's the nature of things that are said during the tirades, the name calling and the put downs, calling someone a sociopath and a liar and a lot of other words that make a difference. Most people that I work with, they explode. They might do something, but they pull back, and they don't keep this anger going. When somebody is able to keep it going and just verbalize it and keep going, it's a rage. It's not just anger. It tends to be rage.
Okay.
Which is scarier to me than anger.
Rage is scary. Why is that?
Because it's bigger than anger. It feels more out of control for most people. Rage feels like a more out of control emotion. Anger seems, and people are intimidated by anger. I mean, people are intimidated by anger in the workplace. They're intimidated by anger, oftentimes even in their relationships if they don't understand where it's coming from. But when someone has a pattern of being angry and continuing to be angry, it can be very intimidating to the person on the other side of it.
Okay. And you were asked questions, do you remember, about whether or not it would be possible if she sent this text to him on purpose to somehow incite him. Do you remember that?
Yes.
I'm showing you Exhibit 440. And I want, if you can review. These messages.
The first
four.
First four. All right.
Okay. And these messages are from January 4th, 2008, right?
Yes.
And it's just a couple of messages. Based on your review of these messages, is it evident that Mr. Alexander sent Miss Arias a text that was meant for someone else? If you're looking at the second box and the third.
Yes.
And does he refer to sending a text message meant for someone else, does he refer to it as I pulled a Jodi?
Yes, he does.
With a smiley face.
Right.
And then she responds laughing, right? Basically laughing in text message language.
Yes, she does.
So is this based on your review of these messages, is it something that seemed to happen before between the two of them, where they accidentally send a text message meant for someone else to each other?
Well, at least on these two occasions.
Okay. And in this particular occasion, there was nobody was upset about it, right?
Nobody was.
And in this instance, with regard to the May 10th exhibit or text message, with the implication or the idea that she would purposely try to somehow incite Mr. Alexander so that she could face his wrath and have him say things to her about, why don't you have him come and fuck you in the woods? Is that something that you see in her behavior anywhere prior to May 10th where she would be insightful like that, wanting to endure his wrath?
I haven't seen that in anything I've read, any of the interviews, any of her journals. No, I have not seen that.
And throughout this text message, she's apologizing, isn't she? Do you see where she's saying that...
I'm trying to read it.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
Here, and I'll switch it too. Where she's talking to him about, let's just adopt a don't ask, don't tell policy, right?
Right.
And do you see where she's in any way trying to ramp up this argument?
No, I see that she's trying to avoid an argument by neither one of them talking about their private lives, that she doesn't, she doesn't want that, and she doesn't think he wants it either, and so she's asking for this don't ask, don't tell policy to keep from having this escalation.
So with information in here about the fact, and do you see a pattern of her doing that in other ranting text messages from Mr. Alexander, a pattern of her trying to de-escalate, a pattern of her trying to apologize, things like that?
Yes, I see that repeatedly.
Okay. So given that information, does it in any way seem that she would purposely send him an email to incite him?
No.
I'm sorry, send him a text message to incite him.
No, and frankly, even if someone did that, the response...
And if someone did that, what?
Even if someone was doing that, the reaction to it...
Overruled.
Even if someone was doing that, even if people were doing, pushing each other's buttons, the reaction to pushing each other's buttons is what I look at, because most of us are the experts on pushing buttons with someone that we care about.
All right. Do you remember being asked questions about self-esteem?
Yes.
And the fact that Jodi received information that she had a high IQ?
Yes.
The fact that somebody has a high IQ or talks about having a high IQ, does that relate to them being having high self-esteem?
No.
And in speaking with the 44 hours that you spent talking with Miss Arias, did you get the sense that this high IQ somehow made her feel better about herself and gave her high self-esteem?
No, I did not get the impression at all that Miss Arias felt good about herself or proud of herself. No, I didn't.
Okay. Do you remember being asked questions about some of the different journal entries?
Yes.
And you were talked to about the question about the journal entry from September 13th, 2007, which is when they go to have a soup pie.
Yes.
Okay. You were asked questions about if all the details of her day were included in this journal entry. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And the implication being that somehow this journal entry would be incomplete then because she didn't write all her details down, right?
Correct.
Have you ever seen a journal where someone details like every single detail, whether they went to the bathroom once or twice?
No, I haven't.
Would you expect to see that in someone's journals?
No.
Does it mean for you that it's then incomplete because she doesn't include all the details?
No, it doesn't mean it's incomplete.
And in fact, in talking with her, you talked about the law of attraction with the prosecutor, right?
Yes,
And that was some of the reason why, and you kept saying in part
right.
of why she might not include all the details with regard to fights with Mr. Alexander or when he assaulted her, right?
Correct.
You kept saying in part that it was in part the law of attraction. Is there another reason why she would not include all the details about Mr. Alexander, negative, bad things about him?
For one thing, she promised him she wouldn't. And so she seemed to say less on the negative end. And the other thing is, you know, depending on who's writing on a journal, they choose to remember what they remember. And so people write in their journals. It's a private place to write. They write in their journals about what they want to remember and what they want to write. So I don't know, you know, people write a variety of things in journals. There's no kind of formula for how to write in a journal.
And if somebody was actually trying to write something down because they were making it up, and let's say, for example, that somebody wants to make up that their boyfriend is hitting them, wouldn't they then want to write it in their journal to show proof that it happened? Wouldn't that be helpful to them?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Approach. May continue.
All right. So there were when you were being asked questions about the journal entries and calling them incomplete because they didn't have every detail of the day, right?
Yes,
And that was the prosecutor calling them incomplete, right?
correct.
If Miss Arias was trying to make it up, if she was making up the fact that Mr. Alexander broke her finger, or if she was making up the fact that he backhanded her across the face, or if she was making up the fact that he kicked her or choked her, wouldn't it be helpful for her to actually write those things down so that she can try and prove it later on if she was making it up? Wouldn't that have been beneficial?
It might have been beneficial it would have been beneficial to have evidence. It's beneficial to have evidence, and most people don't.
And when you talk about most people, are you talking about situations of battered women?
Yes,
With battered women, why isn't there evidence? A lot of times.
because they don't report. They don't want friends and family to know what's going on. Even if they have supportive friends and family, Their supportive friends and family may want them to do something they're not ready to do. They may want them to leave or make a police report. I hear that a lot. Well, you should call the police or you should leave, and people aren't ready to leave. And if they make a police report, they're thrown into a system that can make them feel very powerless. I'm not sure how it works out here, but if you have children and the police are called, the Department of Children and Family Services comes out. People are afraid that they will lose their children. People are afraid that they will have enormous fines to pay. People are afraid they'll ruin their partner's career, or that something they say will become public. There are just so many reasons that people don't report, that it's actually less common for people to report than for them to report. And oftentimes when a report is made, it's maybe because a neighbor heard something and made a call, and the police come out on that call.
Does that cause problems for battered women in general then, that there is this commonality with battered women of lack of reporting?
Yes, it's one of the toughest things with domestic violence cases is that pulling together evidence that there's domestic violence, you have to oftentimes look at the person's word, but that's not enough evidence. The person's word in and of itself isn't enough evidence.
And
have to have...
Can I ask you something with that? When you say the person's word, are you talking about like if a woman were to call the police and say something happened to her?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Or, if a person was to go to court and say that something happened, you need some evidence that supports what you say. You can't just have, our court system is based on that. You have to have some evidence that things happen. So you have to look at what corroborates the truth of what somebody says. So if somebody talks about being physically abused and you have history and you have documentation of a lot of verbal abuse, you have more reason to believe that that's happening.
And do you have that here? Do you have history and documentation of verbal abuse here?
Yes, I do. And
so does that give you a better reason to believe that there was physical violence as well?
Yes.
And did you also see Miss Arias' broken finger?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell that it was not healed in a straight way?
Objection, Circulation Act, Foundation Rule 703.
Approach, please.
Miss Violette, at some point in time, did you notice Jodi's hand, that it had a finger that will not straighten?
Yes, I did.
Objection, lack of speculation. Which hand?
Sustained.
Is there a left hand?
Judge, leading question. Gave her the answer.
Oh, sorry.
Sustained.
Which hand?
I'll let you know when you want to ask the next question.
Overruled.
Which hand, do you remember which hand it is that you noticed this bent finger on?
I think it was her left hand, but I'm not sure. I just remember it was this finger, the fourth finger.
Her ring
and it was
finger?
bent, yeah.
Okay. And you remember that it was bent?
Yes.
Objection, leading.
I'm just repeating what she said.
Overruled.
Do you remember that it was bent?
Yes, I did.
Okay. All right. With regard to the journal entry from September 13th, 2007, when they go to have a soup pie, you were given hypotheticals. Do you remember that?
Yes.
About how the fight supposedly started?
Yes.
And assume then, for this hypothetical, that Mr. Freeman came in and testified that Miss Arias, that he unloaded her backpack a little bit to lighten the load, okay?
All right,
Because they're all getting ready to go hike,
all right,
all right? And when Miss Arias saw that her backpack had the stuff taken out of it, that she got upset in general.
all right,
And then assume that he testified that she wasn't upset with anyone in particular, just upset that things were taken out. Okay?
all right,
And in response to her being upset in general, not at anybody specifically, that Mr. Freeman testified that Mr. Alexander made a harsh and sarcastic comment. Okay?
all right,
And after that, they went upstairs, or I'm sorry, Miss Arias goes upstairs, and then Mr. Freeman testifies that Mr. Alexander went after her, and they were talking for about 20 minutes, and he can hear Mr. Alexander's loud voice yelling. Okay?
Objection, Ms. Rice's testimony of yelling.
Approach.
All right, so you've assumed all those things, right?
Yes.
Okay. Is it important to you that, or does it mean anything to you that Mr. Alexander reacts in a way to Jodi being upset in general, not at anyone specifically? Is it important to you that he reacts with a harsh and sarcastic comment directed right at Miss Arias?
Well, not if it stands on its own.
Okay.
Because people can do that. Any
Right.
human being can get angry and make a harsh and sarcastic remark. So that standing on its own had no relevance to me.
Okay.
The fact that there was a pattern of harsh and sarcastic remarks and worse, that made a difference to me.
So is this a point then that you would consider in looking at the overall pattern of him making harsh and critical comments to Miss Arias?
It's one of the things I would consider.
All right. What about the fact that Miss Arias goes upstairs by herself and then Mr. Alexander follows her and continues to have an argument with her, yelling at her?
Objection, Ms. Rice's the evidence.
Jury is directed to recall the testimony previously provided during the trial. You may continue.
Thank you. The fact that Miss Arias goes up by herself and that Mr. Alexander seems to follow her and continue with an argument. Taken alone, I'm guessing you're going to say that doesn't mean necessarily anything. If we look at this in a greater pattern, does it mean something to you?
It means something because it's the continuation, his apparent inability to stop, his apparent inability to stop it when he gets really angry, that he just keeps going with it. And if he happens to be in the same room, that he might follow. We call it playing chase.
You call it, I'm sorry, what?
playing chase when one person doesn't allow the other person to get away and have some time on their own. And that's not something that lots of people don't do. I mean, that's not an uncommon behavior. You just have to look at the entire context.
Okay. All right. And so looking at this in the entire context, this is September of 2007, and then would you consider these actions in conjunction with all the other actions you see up until June of 2008?
Yes.
You were asked questions about journal entries in general. I think specifically the August 26, 2007 journal entry, where it doesn't mention necessarily negative things about Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And is that the journal entry that there's a half a page torn out?
Yes.
And then did you see Miss Arias's actual journal where you saw pages torn out?
Yes, I did.
And have you seen journal entries where Miss Arias talks about promising that she will not write negative things about Travis, that she promised Travis that she wouldn't write negative things about him in her journals?
Yes, I have.
So the fact that she makes this promise and the fact that there's torn out pages, well, why did she tear out those pages? Did someone tell her to do it?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Do you know who told her to take those pages out?
Mr. Alex?
Speculation, lack of foundation.
Overruled. Do you mean answer yes or no?
Yes.
Who is that?
Mr. Alexander?
And is that part of a controlling behavior on his part, telling her to rip pages out that were negative about him?
Yes.
And do those torn out pages, do they come before she talks about making a promise to him about not writing negative things? Do they come before? They're all contained in the same journal, right? Where she's
Right.
talking about making a promise to him about not writing negative things.
Yes.
Okay. So when we're looking at the big picture of her journal entries, you were asked questions about whether or not there was anything in these journal entries that ever detail when he kicked her, right? And broke her
Yes.
finger?
Yes.
And is there anything in the journal entry about that?
No.
And does she ever specifically give details about when he strangled her?
No.
Does she ever give any details in her journal about when he backhounded her?
No.
Is that consistent with the controlling behavior from Mr. Alexander of tearing out pages when she did write negative things?
Yes.
And is it consistent with what she writes about her promise to Mr. Alexander to
Yes.
not write bad things about him?
Yes.
Is it consistent with her following this law of attraction?
Yes, it's consistent with all of those things.
Is it also consistent with someone who is battered minimizing what actually is going on?
Yes.
And can you tell us what that means then, minimizing?
Minimizing or denying is when you look at something that's happened and you find a way to make it fit into sort of your worldview, make sense of it. So you usually describe it as less than what it was. We had groups in the shelter and outreach groups and individual sessions where women who were abused and I worked with some men who were abused where they would minimize what was going on. They would talk about it as, well, it wasn't as bad as it seemed, or it might sound bad, but it really wasn't that bad at the time, or it's not happening every day. And that's one of the biggest ones I hear. This doesn't happen every day. This doesn't happen every week. This is, unusual behavior, or this person doesn't usually call me names, or whatever that is. Or they don't tell you all the names that they call you. They tell you less than what's actually happened, and that's really common.
Why do they do that, though?
Well, you have to live with yourself. You love somebody, and you don't want to think that somebody you love really thinks those things about you. So you explain it to yourself so you don't have to feel horrible. And so that probably you're not ready to leave and you don't have to leave.
And so if she were to memorialize these horrible things that he did to her, would that be then, well, would that be helping her to remember these horrible things? Is that something that battered women want to do?
No, most of us don't want to remember things that are upsetting to us.
Well, let's just talk about battered women.
Okay.
Most of battered women that you work with, do they want to remember the horrible things that the abusers do to them?
No, they don't.
And by memorializing it in a journal that they keep, journals that they've kept since being a young child, then wouldn't that memorialize it for them? Wouldn't that remind them on an almost constant basis of the horrible things that the abuser did to them?
Yes.
In reading through her journal entries, does she talk about, generally speaking, negative things about Mr. Alexander? Does she say some negative things?
She says some negative things, and they are general.
Okay. Does she talk about then him having harsh words or critical words for her?
Yeah, and cruel behavior.
And cruel behavior, okay. But does she specifically put things in there where... Did you ever see anywhere in her journals where she says that he called her a slut?
I don't remember.
Okay. Did you ever see her write anything about that he called her a whore?
I don't remember that either.
And what about, did you ever see anything in her journals where he called her a three-hole wonder?
No.
And did you ever see anything in there where she's telling her journal that he called her a bitch?
No, I don't remember her talking about name-calling in her journal.
None of those specific things in her journals, right?
Not that I remember.
But yet when you read the instant message between them, when he is ranting to her on May 26th, he calls her all those things, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
And so you know from reading those instant messages that that is truthful. Those things happened, right?
Yes.
But yet we don't see it in her journal.
Yes, we don't see it. I mean, no, we don't see it in her journal.
Okay. You were asked some questions about manipulation, right? Judge, may I approach?
Yes.
Or we approach, actually.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break until 4 o'clock. Please remember the admonition, you are excused. We are in recess. Questions? Please be seated. The record will show that.
Thank you, Judge. Do you remember being asked questions about whether or not you believed Miss Arias?
Yes.
And do you remember talking about going into a case with a certain amount of skepticism?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us what you meant?
Whenever I take...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the objection.
Relevance.
Overruled.
When I take or when I investigate a case, I don't presume that what I'm being told is the truth. I need to figure that out for myself. I need to have enough to go on. And there are cases I don't take because there either is not enough evidence from my perspective, or I don't believe the person I'm talking to, or I don't have enough time to do a good job. But I have gone into cases and been halfway through cases where I decided that I couldn't testify in those cases. I have testified for a police officer who...
So when you first are on a case and you say you enter the case with some skepticism until you have some more information, right?
Yes.
Did you do that in this case?
Yes.
And did you have skepticism when you first met with Miss Arias? Before you first met with Miss Arias?
Yes. I didn't want to... I wasn't sure I wanted to take this case at all.
Okay. And after speaking with Miss Arias, was she able to answer some of your questions that you had?
Yes.
And working throughout this case, was there ever a time that you felt you needed to withdraw from it?
Checks and relevance.
May I approach, Judge? Ms. Violet, during your time on this case, when you are investigating it and looking through all of the evidence, as you said you've done in the past, withdrawn from a case, did you ever feel the need to withdraw from this case?
No.
All right. So let's... When you first met with Miss Arias, do you remember the questions about apologizing to her?
Yes, I do.
The fact that... Why did you apologize to her?
Because I was genuinely sorry that I invaded private space that people, things that people write and things that people pour out on a page that they believe is private, that's not something that I usually do. And I wanted her to know that I understood what I was doing. And I thought that in her understanding that maybe we'd have a little trust and she would be able to talk to me more easily.
And is her situation different from when you're counseling or when you have battered women come and speaking to you? Are those women coming to you with their problems?
They are, but they generally don't tell me lots of things when they first meet me. It's usually over a period of time when they begin to trust you, and the same with the other folks that I work with. As one of my clients just said, Alice,
so is it different than with Miss Arias? Because at the point that you met her, did you already know a lot of very personal information about her?
yes, I did.
And information that most of us would consider, in a sexual nature. Did you know a lot of information about sex contact between her and Mr. Alexander?
Yes,
And is that something that is normally kept in private?
yes, it is.
And so is that what your apology had to do with?
Objection has been answered.
Sustained.
So when you went in there and apologized to her, is there anything about that makes you feel like you were biased already for her?
Not at all. No.
Were you ever concerned about liking her too much that you can't give an honest opinion about whether or not she's a battered woman?
No. I just haven't had that come up in a situation where I've liked somebody so much that I can't remove myself. Testimony to me is very significant and very important, and it doesn't matter what kind of case it is, and this case is very serious. But I think when people are talking about losing their children or not having access to their children or losing an inheritance, whatever that would be.
Sustained.
She's explaining why it's important.
Ask another question.
In your counseling, when you have clients come in your door and you're having your your men's group,
Yes,
and some of those men, I imagine, in the past have done some pretty awful things to people, right?
correct.
The fact that some of those men may have done pretty awful things and you don't like what they've done, does that make it so that you're not able to work with them?
No, it doesn't.
And when you have battered women come and see you, and you might feel badly for their situation or what they've been through, do you ever feel that way for them?
Yes,
Does it mean that you can't work with them and give them an honest assessment of what they might need to do for their own life?
no, it doesn't.
And did you have any problems like that when you were talking with Miss Arias and forming your opinion with regard to this case, being a domestically violent relationship?
No, I did not.
All right, let's talk for a second about a couple of small details from Miss Arias' past, okay?
Sure.
Do you remember being asked questions about a childhood friend of hers who knew her when she was in grade school?
Yes,
And did you review a interview of this childhood friend from Miss Arias that she knew her in grade school?
yes,
And this interview would have been, because we're talking about a friend of hers from grade school, this interview would have been conducted about 20 years after this woman knew Miss Arias, right?
correct.
Do you remember being asked questions about what some of the things that this woman said
Yes,
about Miss Arias?
yes,
And were you asked questions about whether or not Miss Arias would play a victim when she was in grade school.
Yes,
And then later on, the prosecutor talked, well, immediately after that, the prosecutor talked to you about something that occurs much later in Miss Arias's life, when she is actually after June 4th working at the Purple Plum. Do you remember that?
yes,
And how did the prosecutor ask you questions about how she acted with men in working at the Purple Plum?
correct.
Those two incidents from grade school and then after June 4th of 2008, 20-some years later, does that in any way form a pattern for you?
No, it doesn't.
Is there any possible way that two incidents, 20-some years apart, is going to make a pattern in your line of work?
Not that I can see, and not regarding domestic violence.
Okay. And the prosecutor was talking to you about also some of the things that Mr. Arias talked about, his own daughter, right?
Yes,
And you said you were trying to tell the prosecutor some of the things that you would want to consider with whatever Mr. Arias said about her, right?
correct.
What are some of the things that you would want to consider about Mr. Arias?
Well, for one thing, it's pretty tough when a parent has to look at their own behavior in relationship to their children.
What do you mean?
According to reports, Mr. Arias has been abusive with Jodi, and controlling and manipulative with his wife, and there are patterns of that. So it would be difficult to have to tell somebody that. So that would be one thing.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd consider?
Well, I consider that Mr. Arias and his daughter had an estranged relationship. So communication between the two of them hadn't been good for years, and that they didn't have regular communication. So what he said would come out of a sort of a limited framework. And after she moved back to Wairika, which was some, I think, 10 years or so after she had left, and they hadn't had a lot of contact.
Well, you asked questions about a comment from him about Miss Arias' truthfulness when she was a teenager.
Yes,
And so Mr. Arias is talking about a time when Jodi was around 14, right?
correct.
Does it mean anything to you that a parent has an issue with a teenager's truthfulness? Is that unusual?
It's not unusual. People with teenagers know it's not unusual.
So would you take that into consideration in whether or not Miss Arias was truthful during her lifetime prior to June 4th?
No, I mean, my understanding is that it was more sins of omission than commission, that she didn't directly lie as much as she didn't tell them what was going on.
All right. And this was, again, back when she was 14.
Right.
And you remember the prosecutor talking to you about these incidents then? Something from grade school, something from 14, and then something after June 4th, right?
Correct.
And that was in response to your comments about no indication of Miss Arias being untruthful prior to June 4th, right?
Correct.
Anything that the prosecutor said to you change your mind about her truthfulness?
No. He was talking about isolated instances. He was not talking about patterns that you could trace. And I didn't take isolated instances from Mr. Alexander's background and hold that up and say,
Sustained.
So something that would be considered an isolated incident for Mr. Alexander, would that carry much weight with you?
no, it wouldn't.
And when you're talking about patterns with regard to Mr. Alexander or incidents with regard to Mr. Alexander, are you speaking in a global sense of patterns that you see with him?
Currently? Or
Yes, I'm sorry, currently.
Okay, yes, I'm talking about patterns that I see over the time that he was in relationship with Miss Arias that appeared to have been present before.
One of the things the prosecutor talked to you about is your continuum, right? We've been over this.
Yes.
And how do you use this continuum?
I actually have used it a lot in doing training. I use it in conjunction with Michael Johnson's work and Amy Holsworth Monroe and Gregory Stewart's work. And what I do is explain to people about sort of a context of abusive behavior, a range of abusive behavior. And if I have enough time, I show them a video clip and then ask them to break up into groups and assess and create interventions for people so that they begin to look at this range of behaviors and what might be effective ways of intervening with folks to help them out. And then we come together and we do a case conference together. So I use this more in training. I used it in one child custody case where there was a situation of flight risk and dual passports because the judge really thought about domestic
relevance, speculation.
Sustained.
Did you use this in another case before?
Yes, I used it in a child custody case.
All right, so it was not a criminal case?
No, it wasn't.
And was it to help explain to the judge your opinion?
Objection made.
It was to help explain that terrorism wasn't the only kind of domestic violence.
Okay, so is that something that can be helpful with this continuum for people to understand that you don't have to have the most severe type of domestic violence in order for it to be domestic violence?
Yes, and that's one of the most difficult areas, I think, for people to look at, is that you don't have to be a terrorist to create fear and apprehension in someone.
Okay. One of the things that the prosecutor talked to you about is sexual humiliation and degradation. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he was asking you questions about whether or not Mr. Alexander would fit into that category that he was sexually humiliated and degraded, right?
Correct.
You remember being asked questions about something that Mr. Alexander said during one of his tirades with Miss Arias about feeling like a dildo with a heartbeat.
Yes.
And you talked about that there was much more in that tirade versus just that statement, right?
Correct.
And so, having just that statement alone, can you place him and say that he is sexually humiliated and degraded from that single statement?
No, I can't.
Why not?
Because it's one statement, and because I've seen a history of their sexual relationship, and it doesn't appear that he has felt sexually humiliated or degraded by Miss Arias's behavior.
All right. Did you review an email from Lisa Andrews to Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
And in that email, was she talking about their sexual contact between the two of them?
Yes, she was.
And was she talking about being uncomfortable?
She was talking about feeling like maybe she was used and maybe he cared more about her body than her. Yes.
Okay. And do you remember the prosecutor asking you questions that somehow in this email Mr. Alexander was the one who was sexually humiliated because Miss Andrews somehow went too far with him?
Yes.
Objection, Mr. President. Question.
Approach. You may continue.
And you're aware that Miss Andrews, at the time that Mr. Alexander was dating her, was about 10 or 11 years younger than he was?
Yes.
And when she had this discussion with him about going too far, did she take some of the blame for him kissing her and him having contact with her?
Objection, lack of foundation. Source.
Sustained.
Did you review an email from Miss Andrews?
Yes, I did.
Okay. May I approach? Showing you Exhibit 385. Second paragraph. All right. So is she talking to him about actually blaming herself for him kissing her?
Yes.
And throughout the conversation that you've reviewed between Miss Andrews and Mr. Alexander, is she talking about, as you said before, feeling used and that he thinks of sex too much?
Yes.
Is that somebody who you would consider to be sexually humiliated or degraded?
That
That Mr.
Miss
Alexander is sexually humiliated?
Oh, no, I would not.
Okay. And you've reviewed or listened to an audio tape from that is a phone sex tape between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias, right?
Correct.
And this was May 10th of 2008?
Yes, it was.
And in listening to the words on that particular tape, does Mr. Alexander in any way sound uncomfortable?
No, he doesn't.
Does he sound humiliated?
No, he doesn't.
Does Miss Arias say anything to him that degrades him?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. On the other hand, did you speak with Miss Arias about some of the sexual contact that she had with Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
And do you remember being asked questions about some of their first sexual contact between the two of them?
Yes.
And was Miss Arias uncomfortable with it?
Yes, she was.
Because why?
She thought it was too much too soon.
Okay. So, but she went along with it anyway, right?
Yes, she did.
And is that something she talked to you about that she did several times throughout the relationship?
Yes.
And did she feel that she got more attention from Mr. Alexander when she gave him the sexual things that he wanted?
Objection, leading.
Yes, in fact, she said that
Objection, beyond the scope.
Sustained.
No, Judge. May we approach?
Well, you can ask a follow-up question. She answered yes. So you can ask a follow-up question.
All right. Then following up on that, what did she say to you?
she said this in an email or one of those written
Objection,
forms.
lack of foundation. Source. Email or.
Sustained.
Whether it's an email or an instant message, does it matter to you?
No,
Was it written communication?
it was written communication.
Okay, and what is it that you learned?
Objection, lack of foundation. Source.
Approach, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the evening recess. Please be back tomorrow morning tomorrow is 10:30. 10:30 a.m. Have a nice evening. Remember the admonition. jury has left the courtroom. We are at recess.